Greetings, everyone. I am Katora Butler-Reed, president of the Albany State NAACP Chapter, and I'm honored to stand in front of you all today as NAACP's first Speaker Series. And I also want to give a special shout out to CUFI on campus for agreeing to collaborate with inviting Mr. Irvin Roth to Albany State University. Now I will have my mental health chair, Aaliyah Allen, give us a brief summary on the Holocaust.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Allen, and I am Mental Health Chair of NAACP. As many of you know, the Holocaust was a systematic state-sponsored persecution and the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. The Nazis came to power in Germany in January 1933. They believed that the Germans belonged to a race that was superior to all others. They claimed that Jews belonged to a race that was inferior and a threat to the so-called German racial community. In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe stood at over 9 million. Most European Jews lived in countries that Nazi Germany would occupy or influence during World War II. By the end of 1945, the Germans and their allies and collaborators killed nearly 2 out of every 3 Jews as a part of the final solution. In 1941, Nazi officials opted to employ an additional method to kill Jews, one originally developed in euthanasia program: stationary gas chambers. Between 1941 and 1944, Nazi Germany and its allies deported nearly 3 million Jews from areas under their control to Nazi-occupied Poland. The vast majority were sent to killing centers, often called extermination camps, at Belzec, Kelmel, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered primarily by means of poison gas. Some able-bodied Jewish deportees were temporarily spared to perform forced labor in ghettos, forced labor camps for Jews, or concentration camps in Nazi-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Most of these workers died from starvation and disease, or were killed when they became too weak to work. In the final months of the war, SS guards moved camped inmates by train or on forced marches, often called death marches, in an attempt to prevent the Allied liberation of large numbers of prisoners. As Allied forces moved across Europe in series of offenses against Germany, they began to encounter and liberate concentration camp prisoners, as well as prisoners en route by forced march from one camp to another. The marches continued until May 9, 1945, the day German armed forces surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. For the Western Allies, World War II officially ended Europe on the next day, May 8, V-Day, while Soviet forces announced their Victory Day on May 9, 1945. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, more than 250,000 survivors found shelter in displaced person camps run by the Allied power and the United Nations Refugee and Rehabilitation Administration in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Between 1948 and 1951, 136,000 Jewish displaced persons immigrated to Israel, while others resettled in the United States and other nations outside Europe. Other Jewish displaced persons immigrated to the United States and other nations. The last camp for Jewish displaced persons closed in 1957. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Irvin Roth and his wife to Albany State University. Irvin Roth is the director of the Holocaust Resource Center at the Temple Judea of Manhasset, New York, and is the former education director of the Holocaust Memorial and Education Center of Nassau County. An internationally known educator, Mr. Roth has endeavored to teach people about the Holocaust and the lessons that can be learned from the experience. He first began working with CUFI in 2009 by personally guiding CUFI on-campus students through Poland's history of the Holocaust, including Auschwitz, where Irvin was imprisoned as a young boy. In the last 9 years, he has traveled all over the United States with CUFI and spoken at more than 400 of their events. He is a cherished friend and invaluable member of the CUFI family. Would you all please join me in welcoming Mr. Irvin Roth?
Thank you very much. What I would like to do tonight is take you on a journey in time and distance. As you heard the summary of this event that we refer to as the Holocaust, how did this happen? How is it possible in the 20th century, in the cultured world of Europe, and in particular, Western world, how is it possible that a nation, multiple nations actually, legislated the murder of a particular group of people? Not for any profit, because certainly that was not it. Not because of any political reason, or military reason, or economic reason. Just because who they were. And so I want to take you on a journey through my life, because my life and that experience and that event, which we call the Holocaust, intersected my life. So hopefully you'll have an idea what it was like to be born in a country called Czechoslovakia in 1929, exactly halfway between World War I and World War II, in a democracy, to an ordinary Jewish family, in a small city. But life began for me. I was born in 1929, as I said, to a middle-class Jewish family. I had an older brother, parents. I lived in a lovely house, which was actually owned by my grandfather. And as such, my grandparents lived there too. So you can imagine being 5, 6, 7 years old, having your grandparents right there. Now, we all know that grandparents are much easier to manipulate than parents. I mean, if you really, really want something, and there's a question whether the answer to your request would be absolutely no, my recommendation to young people is don't bother arguing. Go to your grandfather, tell him how much you love him. And there's no problem at all. You'll get what you want. And so I'm in this wonderful position of living in the same. My grandfather was a particularly nice guy, easygoing. And the other thing he was very good at is making things. And so even though I got the A's in projects, it's my grandfather who did most of them in school. And so I live in a city of about 7,000 people, a lovely city for its time. Sidewalks, paved roads, stores, soccer stadium, ice skating rink in the wintertime, beach in the summertime, even tennis courts. Jews and Catholics and Protestant and Russian Orthodox living together in total harmony. At age 6, I started first grade in a public school. There was no other school. Every student went to the public school. It's true that after school, in the afternoons or on Sundays, the kids who were Catholic went to catechism class, the Jewish kids went to Jewish schools, and so on. But from the perspective of education, it was a single school, and every single student, that's where he went. And so I start my first day of school. I'm 6 years old. It turns out the city built a brand new school that year, and so I begin my education in a brand new school. First day. I look around, I walk into my classroom and scan the class, and suddenly a vision. The most gorgeous girl that I've ever laid eyes on was in my classroom. And I immediately said to me, this is going to be good. It took a while until I got to know her. by the 3rd and 4th grade, we did homework together. We also held hands once in a while. I live in a house, beautiful little city. In the summertime, I spend my time at the beach. In the wintertime, right outside of town, there's a hill, a good-sized hill. You take your sled all the way up. Takes you quite a bit of time, but then you come down in no time at all. Down, but it's fun. I live in a nice house. I have friends. I have a girlfriend. I'm part of the community. I'm part of the Jewish community, of course. But there's harmony, essentially, between Jews and Catholics and Protestants. Yes, it's true that during Easter time, there might be some problem with some of the Catholic kids because the priest preached a sermon about the fact that Jesus, who he loves, of course, was crucified by the Jews. And what does a 7-year-old know about the history of Jews and who they are? But he does know Irving Roth is a Jew, and he was responsible for crucifying Christ, so let's try and beat him up. But so you knew that, but there was no problem because you didn't go out alone. You went outside with somebody older and tougher. So you didn't have a problem. But essentially, Jews was in partnership with non-Jews. There was Jewish teachers and non-Jewish teachers. My father had a lumber business. He produced railroad ties, had friends and partners. Professors had colleagues in the school. All is peaceful from my perspective. But unfortunately, while all this wonderful stuff is happening to me, I'm 5 and 6 and 7 years old. Meanwhile, the world is beginning to change. Right next door is a country called Germany. In 1932, they had an election. And because of the parliamentary system that existed there, whoever gets the most number of votes then forms the government. At the end of 1932, at the election in Germany, the Nazi Party, that began its existence, its actual existence in 1919 and 1920, gets more votes than anybody else. And the Nazi Party had some very bright ideas. They realized that Germany is in trouble economically. Germany lost World War I. They need to bring something new to the people, and they do. They promised the people of Germany prosperity. A job for every single person in the world. They also did something else, though. They came up with the idea that you need someone to hate. And so their concept was very simple. Since Jews have been oppressed and hated for 2,000 years throughout Europe, why not blame the Jews for every single ill that Germany and Europe has? Germany lost World War I. Why not blame it on the Jews? It's their fault. The fact that Jews were in the German army, in fact, my father, who lived in Hungary at the time because there was no Czechoslovakia, on the day World War I breaks out, he's a second lieutenant. By the end of the war, he's a major in the Austro-Hungarian army, defending the Kaiser, defending Germany, Austria, Hungary, a decorated soldier. I so clearly remember that marvelous picture of my father in their bedroom, my parents' bedroom, in uniform, with medals from World War I. He spent 3.5 or 4 years in the trenches during World War I defending Germany. But now, this new political party that comes along says it's his fault. It's the fault of all the Jews. They betrayed us somehow. And the fact that hyperinflation is taking place in Germany is the result of the Jews. The fact that you don't have a job, the fact you, as a wonderful Army or Navy captain or major, doesn't have a job in 1920 because the Jews put together the Versailles Treaty and eliminated the German army altogether. So hundreds of thousands of members of the armed forces of Germany have no jobs. And you go over to them and tell them, elect me, and you'll be back in uniform, back a major or a colonel. People of Germany buy into this. And in January of 1933, Germany becomes controlled by the Nazi Party, eventually becomes a dictatorship, and things begin to happen. The first thing that they did, they came into power at the end of January of 1933, and by April 1st, 1933, they declared a boycott of all Jewish businesses, of all Jewish products. Telling the German people, you wouldn't want to buy anything from those people who are the cause of all the problems. And it escalates. Slowly. By 1934, they convene a conference, and out of the conference comes something called the racial laws, the Munich laws. What these laws are is establishes a system where Jews can no longer teach, whether they're university professors or kindergarten teachers. Jewish students are no longer permitted to go into schools. Slowly, economic oppression begins. By 1936, Germany is the place where the Olympics take place. 1936 Olympics. Those of you who are aficionado of the Olympics, you know that took place in Berlin and the outside areas of Berlin. No Jew was allowed to participate in any activity relating to the Olympics. Even though some of the athletes of the world were Jewish. Remember Jesse Owens got all those medals? Well, it turns out there was a Jewish young man who was probably a better runner, or certainly equal to Jesse Owens, but he did not participate because Germany said no Jew, even though you're an American. Not allowed to. And you would imagine the World Olympic Committee would say, can't do. After all, isn't the Olympics have to do something with ability in sports? What does it have to do with religion or ethnicity or color? But the Olympic Committee did nothing. They accepted this. And then comes 1938. 1938, many things happened. By 1938, the Jews of Germany are oppressed. By 1938, Poland already has something called the Jew bench, where Jewish kids can still go to school, but they must sit in a separate area. Hungary begins to persecute Jews. The infection of anti-Semitism or hatred of the Jews is spreading. And so you can imagine Jews don't want to stay there. They want to leave. But as you well know, There are laws of physics that relate to the fact that everybody has to occupy some space someplace. And to be able to leave, you have to go someplace. The gates of the nations were closed to the Jewish people, including the gates of the United States. In fact, in 1938, August, there was a conference in Evian, France, about the issue of refugees, they were called, which really meant Jews. Many nations were represented, 30-some-odd nations. Only one nation was willing to take some Jews. No, it was not the United States. No, it was not Canada. It was the Dominican Republic. The gates of the world were closed to the Jews. And so they're stuck. Even though Jews want to leave, but they can't. And besides that, to leave Germany in particular in 1938 and 39 meant you had to leave everything there. You had a few marks or dollars that you could take with you, and the clothes on your back, but nothing else. Nevertheless, Jews want to leave, but. And the third piece of 1938 is the fact that Germany decides that the density of population is too large, and therefore they need to acquire more land. And the first piece of land is something called the Anschluss, which meaning unity between Germany and Austria. They speak the same language. And so that's what happens. But then the other piece in 1938 is Germany wants a piece of Czechoslovakia, the country I live in. Now, Czechoslovakia is not so happy of giving it up. But the world powers decide it's best to do that. Give it to Germany. If this bully is picking on you, give him the sandwich. But don't fight. And so at a conference in Munich, Germany, the Prime Minister of England, Prime Minister of France, the El Duce of Italy, tell the German government will convince Czechoslovakia to give a peace, provided that's all you want. And so Germany signs a piece of paper in September of 1938, but by the spring of 1939, no more Czechoslovakia. Irving Roth lives in a small city in the portion of Czechoslovakia which is Slovakia, which is like the central portion. There is no more Czechoslovakia. The western part is occupied by Germany, eastern part by Hungary. Where I live is a new country. A new country which has exactly the same ideas as Nazi Germany. It has a Nazi party, a very strong Nazi party, and it takes over. And so by the summer of 1939, I, almost 10 years old, know exactly what persecution is all about. I know that by a simple fact that I can no longer walk into the park without being arrested. I cannot go to the beach because I won't be allowed because I'm a Jew. Slowly, step by step, more and more laws against me. They're very personal. It's I who can't go into the beach. It's I who have to be identified on the street as a Jew by wearing a yellow star. It is I who used to do homework with my girlfriend, remember her? Who was Russian Orthodox. I was Jewish Orthodox. Slight difference. Who won't talk to me anymore because I'm a Jew. The laws are there at the beginning of transformation of people. her father told her not to talk to me because I am a Jew, and A, it's not acceptable to be socially involved with even a Jewish boy who's 10 years old. And soon, Jewish doctors are shipped to the boondocks. Jewish attorneys can no longer practice law. By September of 1940, every Jewish student, including Irving Roth, is thrown out of school because he's a Jew. Every Jewish teacher in every single educational institution in all of Slovakia is fired. And the next major economic step is Jews are no longer allowed to own a business. Imagine you're a Jew and you own a business, and next door to you or 3 blocks down from you is a Christian who wants your business. He can come into your business and throw you out. So here's my father, whose problem is that he has a business. And anybody can walk in and throw him out. So my father decides to contact one of his very, very dear Christian friends. Albert was his name. And he approaches Albert and tells Albert about what's going on. Albert looks at my father, Joe, what can I do? Is there anything I can do to help you? My father says, you can. Very easy. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is allow me to use your name and transfer my business to your name. And thus it automatically becomes a non-Jewish business and no one can touch it. Albert, having been a friend for decades, says, whatever, let's do it. 3 months go by, and one day in my father's business, walking as Albert, and says to my father, Joe, how is business? Great, says my father. He says, I'm glad to hear that. Obviously, you're a fabulous manager. So you know what? You can continue manage my business. Remember the emphasis, my business. I'll even pay you. But the profits are mine. People were transformed. And so that is by 1940, 41. Meanwhile, Germany and its allies, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, are expanding further. By September 1st, 1939, Germany wants a piece of Poland. Poland refuses. World War II begins. Within 5-6 weeks, there is no more Poland. And every law that Germany had in Germany and the Slovaks had in Slovakia now applies to Poland, to the Jews of Poland. In Poland, by 1940, the Jews are put to ghettos. But the expansion continues. Very soon, Belgium no longer exists. Holland. Norway. Everything from Norway north all the way to Greece south all becomes part of the Nazi Empire. And everything from the English Channel to the border of the Soviet Union becomes Nazi-controlled. In 1941, Germany, though it has a contract, an agreement with the Soviet Union not to attack each other, attacks the Soviet Union in June of 1941. After all, they had an agreement. Russia, Soviet Union, totally unprepared. And the German army and the Hungarian army and the Slovak army, they're all pushing deep into the Soviet Union. And normally you would think that they will now begin to establish anti-Jewish laws. They don't do that, my friends. What they do is get trained units of German army who comes into villages and towns and cities of the Soviet Union. They gather the Jews, march them out into the forest, and machine gun them. With the full knowledge of the Western world. Because in August of 1941, Great Britain broke the German Communications Code. So every single day, as the information flows from the front line into Berlin, with the number of Jews and places that were murdered, all that information is available in London and Washington. Nothing was done. But my friends, that was insufficient for Germany. Because after all, as you heard, over 9 million Jews were living in all of Europe. And all they managed to kill, to murder, is maybe 500,000 in 6 months. It'll take 10 years to get rid of all the Jews. And that's just simply too long. And so when you have a problem, you put together a conference, which they did. On the 20th of January of 1942, a conference takes place, referred to as the Wannsee Conference. It's a city, the suburb really of Berlin. And they're gathered in this magnificent villa. Our scientists, doctors, military personnel, and on that day, they're told to come up with a solution to a problem. How are we going to get rid of all the Jews of Europe? Quickly, efficiently, and cheaply. And this group of educated people, in fact, 1/3 of the group of people sitting in that conference had PhDs. And so their task is to come up with a solution to the Jewish question, the final solution, the death of every single Jew in Europe. This group, in 1.5 hours, 90 minutes, they came up with a solution. We'll build death camps, put it someplace where lots of Jews live, namely in Poland, and bring the Jews from all over Europe to those death camps. We'll murder them by gas, which is cheap. And we'll build crematoria ovens and burn their bodies. And all that's going to be left of the Jews of Europe is ashes. How does that affect me? The summer of 1942, 6 death camps are fully operational. And in my city, of 7,000 people, there are over 2,000 Jews living there. On a Friday night, there's a knock on every Jewish home. And with the exception of maybe 10%, but 1,800 human beings, in the middle of the night, taken from their home, men, women, and children, and marched into the synagogue. The reason you put them into a synagogue, because nobody needs the synagogue except Jews. You wouldn't put them into a gym or to the theater because that's needed. Imagine 1,800 people in a room which is smaller than this, with no air conditioning, with no running water, with no bathrooms. And there the Jews are locked under guard for a day and a half. Day and a half goes by, the doors are open under guard. 1,800 human beings are marched to the radio station, stuffed into cattle cars. The doors are slit closed and padlocked, and the train begins to move. Days go by, they disappeared. My Jewish school that was formed after we were thrown out had about 300 students. Now we have 11 still there. School had a staff of about 30 people. One teacher is left. My family's left there too because my father is still running Albert's business, so he needs them temporarily. The Jews are gone. A few months go by, my grandfather and grandmother are arrested. We get them out. But we know that we are in mortal danger. And so we managed to cross the border into Hungary. Hungary still have all its Jews. Because what Hungary did, said, this is nuts to get rid of people. We can use all the Jewish men, put them into a slave labor force, not pay them, of course, and hardly feed them. We'll leave the families at home and let them send food and attach them to the army. After all, we are fighting a war against the Russians. Let the Jews fix the bridges, build roads, march in front of tanks and find the mines, rather than just shipping them out and killing them. So in a way, Hungary becomes a haven. We managed to cross the border. It's 1943. 1944 comes along, and of course, as you know, the war is getting to the point where there is no question. By the middle of 1944, Germany and its allies is going to lose the war, because the American army has entered the war in 1941, December, and by this time, Italy is under control of American troops. The invasion of France is about to begin. And Irving Roth and close to 500,000 Jews of Hungary are still at home, alive. But the Nazi government of Hungary decides the time has come to get rid of the Jews. And so in the spring of 1944, 437,000 Jews are picked up, spend a few days in a ghetto, and then into cattle cars to death camps. This time, Irving Roth is not so lucky. This time, I'm in a cattle car. One day goes by, second day. By the end of the third day, the train that I'm riding in this cattle car with no windows, no place to sit, no bathrooms, no running water, stuffed full of people. There's no place to sit. There are 80, 100 people to a cattle car. The train stops. It's nighttime. The doors are slid open. And we hear voices. Get out quickly, take nothing with you. I get off the train, I look around. In the distance, I see flames coming out of chimneys. Scary. I'm 14 years old. What is this place? What happens here? But I don't have time to even reorient myself to being outside of a cattle car, and suddenly I realize that 90% of the people who got off the train are marching in the direction towards those chimneys with the flames. I am on the left-hand side, walking away from the railroad tracks, away from the chimneys. My brother, my grandfather and grandmother, my aunt, my 10-year-old cousin, all are marching towards those buildings with the chimneys and flames. They're told they're going to take a shower, but of course, what they did, they were marched, men and women are separated, told to go downstairs, set of steps to take a shower. To do that, you'll get undressed. They're told to remember where they put their clothing. They're told to make sure you take your shoes and tie them together just to make sure that when you get back from the shower, you don't have a mismatched pair. And they're given a bar of soap. It's a big sign over a door, bathhouse. They walk in. In the ceiling are shower heads. They have soap in hand, waiting for water to come out. But my friends, that's not what it is. This was a gas chamber. No water came out. What came through the ceiling is something which looks like crushed marble. And as it descends, it begins to form a smoke. And they can't breathe. 20 minutes go by and they're all dead. My grandmother, my aunt, my 10-year-old cousin. 1,000 women murdered in one. 1,000 men in another one. And a third one and a fourth one. Of the close to 4,000 people that came that night in the train with me, 24 hours later, 300 were still alive. The rest of them were ashes. So here I am, 14 years old, almost 15. I'm assigned, first thing that happens to me, I'm standing in formation, and alphabetically, we seem to be called to a little table with a chair on either side, and the man in this uniform of a striped gray and blue pants and jacket and hat sits on the other side, tells me to roll up my sleeves, and he starts poking my hand with a tattoo to let me know that I'm not a person. I'm a number. It's indelibly put into my arm to recognize the fact that I am the property of the German government. Eventually, I wind up working with horses. Now, mind you, I grew up in a city. What did I know about horses? I knew that a horse had a head, a tail, and a body. But how do you convert that to an animal that pulls a plow? That I had to learn quickly. Because if you didn't learn quickly, you didn't live very long. And so, my friends, that's what I do from early morning to late at night. On a diet of some black liquid, simulating coffee. At noon, some soup, and at night, a piece of bread. I'm always hungry. 350 calories is what the diet consists of per day. A human creature can live on that for a while and use up all the reserve. But eventually, the reserve gives up. Some earlier, some later. But not to be a burden that is fed 350 calories a day and don't produce a full day's work of 12, 14, 16 hours is useless. And thus you have something called a selection. You come home from work, you'll be marched into an area where the showers were, get undressed, given a bar of soap, and go and take a shower. Hundreds of shower heads. But before you got into the shower, there'll be a doctor. Look at you naked and determine if you should continue to live another day. Didn't even say anything, simply looked at the number, wrote it down on a pad, and next morning, into the gas chamber you went. Life and death, determined by a doctor in an instant of time, in milliseconds. Unfortunately, by January of 1945, the Russian army was approaching this death camp that I was in called Auschwitz. Of the 1.2 million people that were brought to Auschwitz, 60,000 were still alive. And so we were marched out on a death march. You marched or you died. Fortunately for me, I kept marching. I wound up in a place called Buchenwald, a concentration camp, where the food was less. But you're talking about already end of January of 1945. One day I'm with my brother and he's taken away. I never saw him again. I'm trying to survive because I know the war is over. Germany and Hungary, Italy and Slovakia will lose the war. All I have to do is stay alive. But my friends, at the beginning of April of 1945, a month before the end of the war, death marches again. I managed to hide. Day after day, 5,000 one day, 10,000 another day, marched out. But these people who were marching out, including myself, were down to 70, 80, 90 pounds. I was a skeleton, hardly able to drag myself, never mind march. Luckily, on the 10th of April, the day I'm supposed to be marching, I'm standing in formation, and I know I can't make it. I need a miracle quickly, and my friends, that day, there's a miracle. The American Army, rather Army Air Force, was bombing the cities around Buchenwald. And of course, while the bombing takes place, the guards didn't want to get killed. So they waited, and I survived another day. But next day, 11 o'clock in the morning, all the guards disappeared. And 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 American soldiers walked into my barracks. Liberation. I remember the 2 men. One was black and one was white. 2 young, healthy soldiers. They walked into my barracks, and in my barracks there were about 250 15-year-olds. Skeleton shuffling. These 2 men broke down and cried. But immediately they did something worthwhile and useful. They left and they brought down a jeep with 3 big vats of split peas and pork, all we wanted to eat. And we did. We pigged out. Bad idea. Eventually things change and they improve. I get more food and wonderful things are happening because the army commander and the army troops are trying to bring particularly the kids back to life. And the war is over, as you heard, the 8th of May. A month later, transportation becomes available. What do? I'm 15 years old. I'm in the middle of Germany. I decide to go back to Czechoslovakia, hoping and praying that someone in my family is alive. Because when I was taken, my parents were not in the same city. They were in a village. They were rather in Budapest. I was in a village. They were in Budapest. And so I arrived in the little village. First person I asked, anybody from the family, Roth family survived? He says, yes. Very nonchalant. Like I said, where? I run over, I open up the door, and in the middle of the kitchen sits my mother. My mother and father survived. They survived because they were in Budapest. My father got very ill. He was in a coma in a Christian hospital, being taken care of by a particular Christian nurse who insisted that she's going to bring this Jew back to life. And she does. But by the time she's back to life and being discharged, the Jews of Budapest are being shot on the street and dumped into the Danube. They need a place to hide. This wonderful lady lives in a 1-bedroom apartment with her daughter and granddaughter And his son-in-law is in the Hungarian Nazi army, of course, so he's not at home. She offers my parents a place to hide. A week goes by, a month goes by, 3 months go by, they're hiding there, and she provides safety and food, of course. And one night there's a knock on the door. The son-in-law comes home for 3 days. And so the wife explains to the husband about these very, very, very distant relatives who are staying with us. Actually, they're hiding here. And to give them an incentive not to say anything, you mustn't tell anybody, because anybody finds out, they'll tell the police, and the police will find them, shoot them, and the people who tell on them will get a present of 5 pounds of sugar. And besides, if you want to go to bed with me tonight, keep your big mouth shut. And so, my friends, this Hungarian Nazi soldier never betrays my parents. They survived because someone was willing to help. So the war is over, but now you have a few 100,000 people in the middle of Germany, in Austria, who have no place to go. They can't go back because it's dangerous. Because somebody moved into their house or apartment and they don't want them back. Somebody took over their business. He doesn't want them back. Hundreds of Jews are killed, murdered after the war. But the gates of the world are not open. It was not until 1967 that the Jews who are in displaced persons camps, as you heard, close to 300,000, finally has a place to go. To a place that the British used to control and would not let Jews to come there, called Palestine. A small sliver of land, a very small portion of what used to be 2,000 years ago Judea. Just in terms of geographics, Palestine was never a state. Never existed. Palestine was called the area that the Jews used to live, called Judea. And they renamed it Palestina in about 75 of the Common Era. It was an area where the Jews lived, which was all of from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the sea, and going west, and east, going hundreds of miles. That was the Judea. But not this time when they redefined where the Jews can live. It's about 15% of the total what Judea used to be. But nevertheless, a Jewish state. After 2,000 years of persecution and wandering, the Jews finally have a state. Unfortunately, there are those people who didn't want that. They simply said, no. We don't want Jews in this part of the world. What do you mean they lived here 2,000 years ago? Never happened. We make up our own history. And so the day Israel is born, it's attacked by 5 nations. The help of God, they survived. But war after war, terrorism after terrorism, propaganda against the Jewish people, even in 2020, is no different than it was in 1938 and 39 and 40. There are nations who want the destruction of the Jewish people again. But I don't despair, my friends. I'll tell you why I don't despair. Because today, unlike in 1938 and 39, there was no Jewish state. The Jews had no army, navy, or air force. Today they have that. But they have something else. Today, there are Christians who believe that the Jews are allowed to stay alive and have their own state. About 12, 13 years ago, under the leadership of a wonderful gentleman by the name of John Hagee, they put together an organization called Christians United for Israel. You heard the name before. Today, I believe there's something on the order between 7 and 8 million Christians in America who stand by the Jewish people, who say that the lies that the propaganda machine is turning out must be stopped. Because hatred of the Jew, anti-Semitism, has resurfaced with a vengeance throughout the world, even in the United States. Even on the college campus of the United States, 1, 2, hundreds. But anti-Jewish propaganda, hatred, destruction, and slogans are in full force. But fortunately, as I say, there are millions of Christians who say, no way, Jose. We will not allow to do that. The Jewish people, like every other people on this earth, have the right to a piece of turf. And so, my friends, today, those are the first two things which I understand and I appreciate. But it's not enough to have 7 or 8 million people in America saying, not on our watch, we will not allow this to happen. And so I ask you, join CUFI. Join CUFI, become part of those who say murder, mayhem, hatred has no place in our society. And with one voice, tell people in the government of the United States, tell the people of the governments of the world, we will not stand by and let this thing happen again. And with those words and that action, plus the help from the Almighty God, we pray and hope, with your help, the Jewish people will continue to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, you can keep it. Now I'll open the floor for questions, so feel free to just raise your hand, and Dr. Williams will come around. No questions? No questions?
Well, there are only two possibilities, but no one has a question. One is that you slept through the whole thing, and this other one that was a brilliant presentation. Not true. There must be something that you question, or I see some volunteers up there. But
thank you so much for, oh wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story. My name is James, Prem Professor at Albany State, and I'm just interested in the psychology that continued during the time where you were at Auschwitz and post, and how does it impact you today in reflecting on those experiences?
well, part of it, of course, is because I was young and I tried to live. Never been to Georgia yet, so someday I hope to be there, and I am here. But the other piece was sort of, I knew by the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old, there are evil forces. But I also knew there are people in the world who will rise up against this evil. And by 1942 and 43, even this awful stuff was happening to me and all the Jewish people, I believed that forces of good will overcome the forces of evil. And to me, this force that I did not understand, I hardly knew where it was located, called America. When there's freedom, liberty, and justice will prevail. And so that's what gives me the strength to survive. The reason I do what I do is I talk to hundreds of thousands of people, to millions of people for the last 20, 30 years about this, is because I feel it's necessary for people to understand that it all began with words. Hatred, lies that were created as propaganda. These lies and hatreds was transformed into slogans. The slogans got people to act. The action was murder. But by the people who were these people who were committing these heinous crimes? Who were these? Ordinary people who were convinced that what they were doing, they were murdering Jews, that was good. That was patriotic. Unfortunately, there are people throughout the world who are trying to do exactly the same thing, and I say no. I say whoever is willing to listen, I say no. Don't stand by and do nothing. Because as it is often said, the Jews are the canaries in the mine. Now, what does that mean? A canary in the mine, if there's a minimal amount of gas, dies. It's time to get out. It's a measure of the amount of methane. The Jews are simply the first group, because my friends, that's not going to stop with the Jews. It's going to continue. Once the Jews are gone, there must be somebody else we can pick on. Each one of us, whether it be black, white, purple, or green, tall or short, once you allow the idea that murder of a group of people is not only allowed by patriotic, all groups are in danger. And that's what we need to understand.
Question over here. You have a question as well?
Yeah, you can actually go first.
Okay.
While he's getting the microphone, let me just point out that I wrote a book which describes all this in great detail. I have 5 of them left. And if you want one, you can get one. I'd be happy to sell it to you for $15. And if you run out of them, I'll send them to you by mail.
Thank you for being here today. I know you mentioned that governments today are bringing back anti-Semitist rhetoric. My question for you is, do you think there's anti-Semitist rhetoric right now in the U.S. government? Or do you think there are people in Congress or in other large branches of power in the government that are bringing back that anti-rhetoric here as well?
Unfortunately, I must admit to you, I see it growing. The same lies, the same fabrication is alive and well. There are those people who, remember I mentioned the word boycott, who are now in the process of legitimizing and supporting the boycott of the Jewish people. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the Jews who happen to live in Israel. And then you have to listen to their slogan. Their slogan is, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In other words, not some piece of Palestine, but all of it, including where the Jews live, must be free of Jews. This, unfortunately, is heard in universities, and sad to say, even the Congress of the United States, there are those who support the idea of wiping the Jews off the face of the earth. And that's what's scary. And this is why it's important to understand what the truth is. And that is why I ask people, Jews and Christians and Muslims and Hindus, every group of people is willing to listen, I ask them, join together against the forces of evil. Because by this, we can stop it. And that's what I hope to do. Unfortunately, those words, as you say, are heard. Not just on the college campus. In the hallowed halls of Congress. Certainly at the UN. If one watches and listens to what's happening at the UN, you can go kind of... Do you know that the United Nations, a number of weeks ago, a special group was discussing human rights? And would you believe it that nations in the United Nations stood up at the rostrum and praised Iran for its record of human rights? The only nation that was called to be the worst human rights offender is Israel, the Jewish people. That took place at the UN, which at first seems like, come on, this is not a joke. This is where we are. Glibly, I say, seems to me there are organizations, major world organization, that the inmates took over the asylum. Iran is lauded as the greatest supporter of human rights, and Israel is sanctioned. It seems like it's upside down. And so we need to have our voices heard in unity, not on our watch.
Thank you, Mr. Roth, for coming and speaking. My name is Amna. I'm a community organizer here in the community, and I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. I actually grew up in a predominantly Jewish community outside the DC area, and when I was in college, I was the president of a national pro-Israel, pro-peace organization. So I wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. I did have a question. I've had the blessing, really. I studied abroad in Jerusalem. I've been to Israel several times, and I've worked a lot with different American Jewish, Palestinian, and Israeli leaders. And like the person said, sorry I didn't catch your name, I think we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. Just in this past Hanukkah, there were so many anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish people. I guess my question is, a lot of the anti-Semitism, I have two questions. One, while I was living in Jerusalem, I met a lot of Israelis who were only able to come to Israel because of oppression they experienced in their home countries. Israel was the only place they could go. I also saw and worked with a lot of Palestinians whose homes were demolished by the military, whose land was taken over, who were displaced. And the Israeli military establishment for a long time has said one of the biggest threats to the Israeli people is the military occupation over the Palestinian people in their land, and that's not a sustainable situation for the Jewish people or the Israeli people. So one, how do you reconcile a group like Christians United for Israel, which is Christians who are pushing US policy that ultimately hurts Palestinian and Israeli people? And two, living here, I hear a lot of anti-Semitism on a daily basis. And a lot of it is from Christians who think that they know better than Jews about what the Jewish people want. or they love Israel but they dislike Jewish people. And I guess, have you experienced that, and how do you reconcile that? Because I think that's something that a lot of Jewish Americans are concerned about.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You're saying that Christians in Israel are suffering. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I mean,
Absolute lie. It's an absolute, total fabrication. Now, let me tell you why I can say that. The only Middle Eastern country where the Christian population is rising is in Israel. It's not happening in Syria. It's not happening in Iran. It's not happening in Egypt. The Coptic churches are being burned. It's an absolute lie. In fact, a number of months ago, I had the pleasure of being on the same platform with a priest from Nazareth who spoke about that issue, the lies that are being perpetrated. In fact, one of his side jobs, besides being a priest in Nazareth, he took on a responsibility of getting Christian young men to join the Israeli army, because he's the only people in the Middle East who are not only allowing the Christians to live as Christians, but helping them survive, is the Israeli army, the Jewish people. That whole thing is an absolute, unadulterated lie. Period. End of story. So that's one thing. The second thing, you mentioned something about destroying homes. Yes, it's true. When do you destroy a home? When it becomes a fortification against you. In Gaza, you have some hospitals left, some schools left. What do they use? What do the terrorists use as a place to ship rockets to Israel against civilians? They use hospitals, schools. The problem is that the propaganda has reached even you. It's a bold-faced lie from someone who's been more than once in Israel, who was talking to the IDF. I will tell you this much, that the IDF, Israel Defense Force, has a standard of morality way beyond what the people of the world agree. They go out of their way to make sure that civilians are not hurt. How many armies do you know that send emails and text messages to people living in a particular place in Gaza? Get out of there because we're going to bomb it, because it is a nest for launching missiles against us. Do you know if any other army has done it? The objective is to have everyone live in peace and harmony. We need to understand the totality of the problem without fully appreciating, understanding what is happening on the ground. What is happening in houses of government. In 1948, when the United Nations partitioned Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, the Jews were dancing in the street, happy. Even though it's a small little sliver, it says, hey, finally, after 2,000 years of exile, we now have a place to live. What was the answer to that? Let me tell you something to understand the philosophy. As I told you, I was born in 1929 in September. A week before I was born, 65 students walking home from school in the city of Hebron were massacred by the Muslim Brotherhood. There was no Jew occupying anything. There was no Jewish state. What did the Jews do? They came to Palestine, bought the land from absentee owners, cleared the swamps and got rid of malaria. That was their crime. Between 1900 and 1914, the standard of living of every single person in all of what was then known as Palestine doubled and quadrupled. That was their crime. But you listen to people speaking over megaphones, and they'll tell you fabrications. Total and complete fabrications. And that is the problem. People are inundating the word with words, hatred. The opportunities for peaceful coexistence have been there. In 2001 and 2003, two different prime ministers of Israel said to the leader of the Palestinian Authority, "This is what you want, you got it. There's one particular portion of land we will not give you back, because if you give you back, we'll be destroyed. Because all of a sudden, the width of all of Israel is like 14 kilometers. And you put guns on top of mountains, you'll kill us. We'll give you other land. We'll give you what you want. All we want from you is live in peace." The answer to that, my friends, was murder in the streets of Jerusalem. It is not the Palestinian people. I'm sure that every single Palestinian grandfather wants his grandchildren to go to school, earn a living, and live nicely. Unfortunately, the leadership has no interest in that. Hatred has overcome. And what we need to do is educate people on the facts. One of the problems, though, with education can be if the education that we give is evil and for evil. Education needs to be the moral compass. That, my friends, will overcome. It's not the guns, it's not the missiles, it's understanding, learning how to live side by side. The human beings who believe different things. As a maybe final comment, I want to tell you the following. We always speak of the freedom of speech, the freedom that America provides. So this guy from a country that is oppressive winds up in America. And he knows the one thing he can do is anything he wants. There's freedom. And one day he walks along Fifth Avenue in New York and sees somebody who he does not like the looks of. So he punches him in the nose. And obviously he's arrested. And he comes in front of the judge. And the judge says to him, "What do you have against, what did this man do to you?" "Nothing." "So, why did you punch him?" He said, "It's a free country, I can do anything I want." Whereupon the judge tells him something very profound. Your freedom stops where the other fellow's nose begins. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. On behalf of Albany State and the NAACP, we would like to thank you again for sharing your story. So, Mr. Roth has also agreed to do pictures or anything, and feel free to stop by both NAACP and CUFI on campus tables if you have any more questions or concerns. Thank you all.